One night, 300 aircraft appeared over Tokyo. By dawn, 16 square miles of the city had ceased to exist. Within hours, Japanese military officers who had sworn to fight until death were quietly telling each other something they'd never spoken aloud before. We've lost. Not, we might lose. Not, we face difficulties. But we've lost. Past tense, absolute, final. This is the story of what changed their minds in a single night. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. March 9th, 1945. 7:42 p.m. Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters, Ichigaya District, Tokyo. Lieutenant Colonel Kawabe stood at the eastern window of the operations room on the 4th floor, watching distant searchlights probe the darkness. The air raid sirens had begun wailing 17 minutes earlier, another American nuisance raid, he assumed. Perhaps a dozen B-29 seconds dropping scattered bombs before fleeing back toward the Marianas. He'd seen this pattern dozens of times since November. The Americans would send 20 or 30 superfortresses flying at 30,000 feet, too high for anti-aircraft fire to reach effectively, dropping their payloads with frustrating inaccuracy before disappearing into the night. Annoying, certainly, destructive in a limited way, but nothing that threatened Japan's ability to continue fighting. Kawabe had fought in China since 1937. He'd survived the brutal winter campaigns in Manchuria. He'd witnessed the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. He'd also witnessed the reverses Midway, Guadalcanal, the grinding retreat across the Pacific. But even in defeat, the Japanese military retained its fundamental capability to resist. The home islands remained largely untouched. Industrial capacity, though strained, continued producing weapons. The civilian population, though tired, remained disciplined and obedient to authority. Most importantly, the military's will to fight remained unbroken. Kawabe and virtually every officer in headquarters believed absolutely that Japan could make an American invasion so costly, so bloody, that the Americans would eventually negotiate a conditional surrender that preserved the imperial system and avoided occupation. The strategy was brutally simple: make them pay in blood until their democracy forced them to compromise. The searchlights swung suddenly northward, then westward, then back to the north again. Kawabe frowned. Too many searchlights activating too quickly across too wide an area. This wasn't the usual pattern. He turned from the window and walked quickly to the operations table, where junior officers hunched over maps and status reports under harsh electric lighting. "How many aircraft?" he asked Captain Yoshida, the night duty officer, who monitored reports from civil defense observers stationed throughout Tokyo and surrounding areas. Yoshida looked up from a growing pile of handwritten reports being delivered by runners from the communications room. His face had gone pale. "Sir, the observers are reporting. They're reporting formations everywhere, from Kawasaki to Chiba, the entire eastern approach." "How many?" Kawabe repeated with forced patience. "Sir, they're reporting." "Hundreds." The word hung in the air for several seconds. Hundreds. The Americans had never sent hundreds of B-29 seconds against a single target. Their largest raids had involved perhaps 70 or 80 aircraft. Hundreds was impossible. The logistics alone, the fuel requirements, the bomb loading, the coordination made such numbers theoretically possible, but practically absurd. "Confirm the count," Kawabe ordered, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Observers get confused. They count the same formations multiple times. Verify through multiple stations." But even as he spoke, the Paris Bait and 8 building shook slightly. Then again, harder. The electric lights flickered. Distant explosions registered as low thuds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. North, east, south, too many directions simultaneously. Through the windows, The darkness beyond the searchlights began taking on an orange glow that grew steadily brighter. Major Hiroshi Tanaka burst through the operations room door, his uniform askew, breathing hard from running up 4 flights of stairs. He'd been at the communications center when the raid began, collating reports from civil defense networks throughout the metropolitan area. "Sir," he said, addressing Colonel Nakamura, the senior officer present, "all sectors are reporting incendiaries, not high-explosives incendiaries. Thousands of incendiaries. The fire departments are reporting they cannot contain the fires. The fires are spreading faster than crews can respond. They're requesting military assistance. But—" He stopped, seeming to realize how his next words would sound. "But there's nowhere to send assistance. Everything is burning." Kawabe moved back to the window. In the 17 minutes since he'd last looked outside, the view had transformed completely. What had been darkness punctuated by searchlight beams had become an expanding panorama of fire that stretched across the eastern horizon like a false dawn. Individual fires had merged into rivers of flame that flowed down streets, jumped across canals, engulfed entire neighborhoods in cascading waves of combustion. The Sumida River, that ancient waterway that had defined Tokyo's geography for centuries, was visible as a dark snake winding through an ocean of orange light. Except even the river seemed to be burning, the water's surface reflected the flames so perfectly that it looked like molten metal flowing through the city. "Get me casualty estimates," Colonel Nakamura said quietly. He was a career officer who'd served in every major campaign since the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. His voice remained steady, professional, devoid of emotion, the voice of a man trained to receive bad news and convert it immediately into tactical problems requiring tactical solutions. Nobody answered him because nobody had casualty estimates. Nobody had any estimates at all. The scale of what was happening exceeded anything in anyone's experience or training. Kawabe, still standing at the window, noticed something odd about the flames. They weren't simply burning, they were moving with purpose, spreading in patterns too systematic to be random. The fire was advancing in waves, sweeping from east to west in visible fronts that consumed everything in their path with terrifying efficiency. "They're boxing us in," he said aloud, suddenly understanding. "The formations came from the east. They're dropping incendiaries from the edges inward, creating a perimeter, trapping people in the center." It meant the Americans weren't simply trying to destroy industrial targets or military facilities. They were deliberately creating a firestorm designed to kill as many people as possible in the densest residential areas of Tokyo. This wasn't strategic bombing in any traditional sense. This was something else entirely, something for which the Japanese military had no adequate doctrine, no prepared response, no countermeasure. At 12:15 a.m., 28 minutes after the first bombs fell, the reports from civil defense networks stopped arriving, not because the attack had ended, but because the networks themselves had ceased functioning. Phone lines burned, runners couldn't navigate streets blocked by walls of flame, observation posts fell silent as observers fled or died. The military's carefully constructed system for monitoring and responding to air raids had been overwhelmed in less than half an hour. Colonel Nakamura made the decision that would define the rest of the night. "Cannot coordinate a response we cannot observe. All units will operate independently under local command. Save who can be saved. Contain what can be contained. Record what can be recorded." He paused, then added with remarkable honesty, "And survive if you can." It was an admission that headquarters had lost control of the situation completely. The American raid had severed the command structure's connection to the city it was supposed to defend. For the next several hours, each unit, each firefighting crew, each civilian defense group would be alone in the burning darkness, making decisions without guidance, fighting fires without coordination, saving lives without support. Kawabe volunteered to lead a reconnaissance team to assess damage and establish communication with isolated units. Nakamura approved immediately. Having an experienced officer gather first-hand intelligence was more valuable than having him stand uselessly in headquarters watching reports that were no longer arriving. Kawabe collected a driver, a radio man, and 2 junior officers, commandeered a Type 95 scout car from the motor pool, and headed east toward the fires at 12:40 a.m. They made it less than 2 kilometers before the roads became impassable. Not from rubble, there wasn't much rubble, because wood structures didn't create rubble when they burned, they simply vanished into ash. The roads were blocked by fire itself. Walls of flame stretched across intersections. The air shimmered with heat that made breathing difficult even inside the vehicle. The darkness had been replaced by a hellish orange twilight bright enough to read by. They abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot, staying to the widest streets, moving through smoke so thick that visibility dropped to a few meters. Kawabe tied a wet cloth over his nose and mouth, a futile gesture given the intensity of smoke that burned his eyes and throat despite the protection. The first bodies appeared near the Sumida River. People had fled toward the water seeking safety, only to find the bridges jammed with other refugees moving in multiple directions simultaneously. Some had been trampled in the panic, others had simply collapsed from smoke inhalation and been left behind by the desperate crowds. A few had made it to the river itself and jumped in, only to discover that the water provided no protection from the radiant heat of the flames surrounding them on both banks. Kawabe had seen death in many forms during 8 years of war. He'd walked through battlefields where bodies lay in piles. He'd witnessed the aftermath of Chinese scorched earth retreats where entire villages had been burned with their inhabitants inside. He'd observed mass executions of prisoners and civilians in occupied territories. He'd believed himself thoroughly desensitized to human suffering. But this was different. These weren't soldiers who'd accepted risk as part of military service. These weren't partisans who'd chosen resistance knowing the consequences. These were civilians, men, women, children, elderly who'd been incinerated in their own neighborhoods while sleeping, eating dinner, or huddling in inadequate shelters. The scale overwhelmed individual tragedy. Thousands of personal deaths merged into a single vast catastrophe that defeated comprehension. At 2:17 a.m., nearly 3 hours after the raid began, Kawabe's radio crackled to life with a transmission from headquarters. The fires had finally spread close enough to headquarters itself that evacuation was being ordered. All personnel were to withdraw to secondary command posts in the western suburbs. The message repeated 3 times, then the frequency went silent. Kawabe and his team turned back, navigating by memory through smoke and flame toward where they'd left their vehicle. They found it burned out, the fuel tank had exploded from the heat, leaving only the metal frame. They continued on foot, joining rivers of refugees flowing westward away from the fires. The refugees moved in near silence, too exhausted and traumatized for conversation. Children who'd become separated from parents walked alone, faces blank with shock. Elderly people who'd survived earthquakes and fires in their youth shuffled forward with mechanical determination, carrying whatever possessions they'd managed to grab in their final seconds before fleeing. Young mothers carried infants whose silence suggested they'd suffocated from smoke inhalation, but were being carried anyway because accepting death required acknowledgement these mothers couldn't yet make. By dawn, 5:47 a.m. on March 10th, Kawabe had walked nearly 15 kilometers through burning ruins. His uniform was scorched, his face was covered in soot, his throat burned with every breath. His eyes watered constantly from smoke irritation. But he was alive and mobile, which made him luckier than tens of thousands of Tokyo residents who'd gone to sleep the previous night expecting to see another dawn. He reached the secondary command post in Nakano Ward at 6:20 a.m. and found organized chaos, dozens of officers attempting to compile reports from scattered units, assess damage, account for personnel, and establish some semblance of command structure. Colonel Nakamura had survived the evacuation and immediately pulled Kawabe aside for a first-hand account. Kawabe reported what he'd seen as precisely as possible, using the detached military language that helped maintain emotional distance from unspeakable horror. He estimated fire coverage at more than 15 square miles based on observation points during his trek. He reported the Sumida River bridges blocked by casualties. He noted the complete breakdown of civil defense networks. He described the systematic pattern of incendiary placement that had created overlapping fires impossible to contain. Nakamura listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Kawabe finished, the colonel asked a single question. "In your professional assessment, could we have prevented this?" Kawabe considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, politically dangerous, potentially treasonous if stated too directly, but Nakamura deserved honesty, and the situation demanded it. "No, sir," he said finally. "Our anti-aircraft defenses cannot reach B-29 seconds flying at 30,000 feet with any effectiveness. Our night fighters cannot intercept formations of this size in darkness. Our civil defense cannot contain fires of this intensity once started. We have no countermeasure to this kind of attack. None at all. We could evacuate the cities." The words came out before Kawabe fully considered their implications. Disperse the civilian population into rural areas. Remove the targets. Nakamura's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition that this conversation had just crossed a significant line. Evacuating Tokyo meant admitting the military could not defend it. It meant acknowledging that American air power had achieved complete air superiority over the Japanese homeland. It meant conceding that the home islands were no longer protected sanctuaries but vulnerable targets that could be attacked with impunity. "That would be a political decision far above our authority," Nakamura said carefully. "We will file our reports through proper channels and allow senior leadership to determine appropriate responses." It was the correct bureaucratic answer, but both men understood the reality beneath the words. Senior leadership would not evacuate Tokyo because evacuating Tokyo meant admitting defeat. The emperor resided in Tokyo, the government functioned in Tokyo, the military commanded from Tokyo. Abandoning the capital to American terror bombing would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility and military protection that kept civilian morale intact. So Tokyo would remain, and the raids would continue, and more people would die, because political requirements overrode military reality. Throughout that morning and into the afternoon of March 10th, reports filtered in from units throughout the affected area. The numbers were staggering and still incomplete. Estimated dead, unknown, but certainly tens of thousands, possibly approaching 100,000. Missing, unknown, likely tens of thousands more. Injured. Hospitals overwhelmed, unable to process the casualties arriving faster than they could be treated. Homeless, estimated at 1 million people who'd lost everything they owned in a single night. Industrial damage was almost incidental to the human catastrophe, but it was substantial. Dozens of small factories that supplied parts to larger military production facilities had been destroyed. Miles of railroad tracks were twisted and unusable. Power substations had burned out, leaving entire districts without electricity. Water mains had burst from the heat, leaving no pressure for firefighting and no clean water for survivors. But the true damage couldn't be measured in statistics. The true damage was psychological, cultural, existential. Tokyo had stood for centuries. It had survived the great earthquake of 1923 that killed more than 100,000 people and burned much of the city. It had rebuilt and modernized, and become a symbol of Japanese industrial progress and military power. In a single night, 300 American bombers had erased more than 15 square miles of that symbol, killed more people than the earthquake, and demonstrated that no Japanese city was safe from destruction. As evening approached on March 10th, and Kawabe prepared to return to the ruins for another night of reconnaissance, he overheard a conversation between two senior colonels standing near the command post entrance. They were speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. "How long can we sustain this?" one asked. "We can't," the other replied flatly. "If they can do this to Tokyo, they can do it to Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama. Every city with more than 100,000 people becomes a potential target. We cannot defend them all. We cannot evacuate them all. We cannot sustain the loss of industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, and civilian morale. Then what do we tell the staff?" A long pause. Then, spoken so quietly Kawabe almost didn't hear it. "We've lost." We just haven't admitted it yet." Those words, "we've lost," echoed in Kawabe's mind as he headed back into the smoking ruins of eastern Tokyo. Not, "we're losing," or "we face difficulties," or "we must redouble our efforts." But, "we've lost," simple, declarative, past tense, spoken by a colonel who'd spent his entire adult life in service to the emperor and the military that claimed invincibility. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945, was not the first American air attack on Japanese cities. It was not even the first B-29 raid on Tokyo specifically, but it was the raid that broke something fundamental in the Japanese military's belief system. It was the night when professional officers began privately acknowledging what they couldn't yet publicly admit, that the war was lost, that continued resistance meant only greater destruction, that the promised decisive battle for the homeland would not result in honorable victory, but only pointless death. Understanding why those 300 B-29 seconds had such a profound psychological impact requires understanding what came before the months of planning, testing, and failure that preceded the raid. It requires understanding who made the decisions and why. It requires understanding the specific characteristics of Japanese cities that made them so vulnerable to this particular kind of attack. And it requires understanding the cold military logic that led American commanders to choose this method of warfare despite its terrible cost in civilian lives. This is the story of how American air power evolved from ineffective high-altitude strategic bombing to devastating low-altitude incendiary attacks. It's the story of how doctrine changed when reality refused to match theory. And it's the story of the men who planned, executed, and witnessed the destruction that convinced Japan's military leadership their war was lost. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 15,000 miles away from Lieutenant Colonel Kawabe's reconnaissance through burning Tokyo, another officer was making decisions that would determine the fate of millions. Major General Curtis LeMay stood on the control tower observation deck at Northfield, Guam, watching the last of 334 B-29 Superfortresses disappear into the darkness toward Japan. It was 6:15 p.m. on March 9, 1945. The bombers would reach Tokyo around midnight. LeMay was 38 years old, stocky and blunt-featured, with a perpetual unlit cigar clenched in his jaw, a habit formed to combat chronic indigestion. He'd risen through the ranks by delivering results when others failed. Now he faced the greatest gamble of his career, one that violated every principle of strategic bombing doctrine he'd been taught and had himself taught to others. The B-29 seconds departing Guam that evening carried no defensive ammunition except for the tail gunners. LeMay had ordered all other guns and gunners removed to save weight. The bombers would fly at 5,000 to 7,000 feet altitudes, considered suicidally low, well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. They would attack at night, flying individually rather than in protective formation. And instead of high-explosive bombs aimed at specific factories, they carried incendiaries designed to create maximum fire in residential areas where small workshops supplied parts to larger factories. Everything about this mission contradicted established American bombing doctrine. Everything violated the careful theories developed over years by the Air Corps Tactical School. Everything risked catastrophic losses that would end LeMay's career and potentially doom the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan. LeMay knew this because he'd spent the previous 2 months watching conventional high-altitude precision bombing fail completely. He'd taken command of XXI Bomber Command in the Marianas on January 20th, 1945, replacing Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, who'd been fired for inability to produce results. Hansell had been a true believer in precision daylight, bombing the doctrine that said bombers could strike specific industrial targets with such accuracy that area bombing of cities was unnecessary and morally wrong. The problem was that precision bombing didn't work against Japan. Weather conditions over Japanese cities tended to be cloudy most days, making visual bombing impossible. When visibility did permit attacks, strong jet stream winds at high altitude, a phenomenon American planners hadn't known existed, pushed bombs miles off target. On November 24, 1944, more than 100 B-29 seconds had attacked the Nakajima Musashino aircraft engine plant near Tokyo. Flying at 27,000 feet, they'd encountered jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that made accurate bombing impossible. The factory emerged virtually undamaged. LeMay had watched this pattern repeat through January and February. Raid after raid produced minimal damage to Japanese industry. After almost 4 months of strikes, American forces had yet to destroy a single priority target via precision bombing. Meanwhile, his boss, General Henry Hap Arnold, was suffering his 4th heart attack of the war from stress over the B-29 program's failure to justify its enormous cost. The B-29 Superfortress represented the single most expensive weapons program of World War II. At $3.7 billion, it cost more than even the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. Arnold had staked his career and the future independence of the Air Force on proving that strategic bombing could win wars without costly ground invasions. If the B-29 failed, Arnold's dream of an independent Air Force died with it. And if LeMay couldn't produce results, he'd be fired just as his predecessor had been. The pressure created a crisis that forced fundamental reconsideration of doctrine. LeMay was a pragmatist formed by hardship. His father had been an itinerant worker who moved the family constantly in search of employment, and LeMay had paid for engineering school at Ohio State University by working brutal night shifts in a steel mill. He'd learned that survival required doing whatever worked, regardless of whether it matched theory. What worked, intelligence analysis suggested, was fire. Between May and September 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had conducted bombing trials at Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah on a replica Japanese village built specifically to test incendiary effectiveness. The tests had demonstrated conclusively that Japanese cities, constructed primarily of wood and paper, were extraordinarily vulnerable to incendiary attack. British Bomber Command had already abandoned precision bombing in favor of area attacks using incendiaries against German cities. The results had been devastating. The firebombing of Hamburg in July 1943 had killed more than 40,000 people in a single week. Dresden would follow in February 1945, with similarly horrific casualties. The British approach was controversial, and many American officers considered it barbaric, but it was producing results that precision bombing could not match. LeMay's staff had analyzed a smaller incendiary raid against Tokyo on February 25, 1945. That attack, conducted in daylight from high altitude, had burned nearly 28,000 buildings, the most destructive single raid against Japan to date. The analysis revealed that incendiaries had been dropped from too high, reducing accuracy and limiting bomb loads due to fuel consumption climbing to altitude. The solution was obvious but terrifying: attack at low altitude, at night, with maximum incendiary loads. Low altitude would improve accuracy dramatically and allow each bomber to carry significantly more ordnance because denser air at low altitude put less strain on engines and required less fuel. Flying individually at night would also require less fuel, as pilots wouldn't need constant throttle adjustments to maintain formation. Removing defensive guns except tail turrets would save additional weight, permitting even larger bomb loads. The risks were substantial. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, though less sophisticated than German flak, would be far more effective against low-flying targets. Night fighters could intercept individual bombers more easily than formations. Engine failure at low altitude over enemy territory meant certain death or capture, with no altitude cushion for emergency procedures. And if Japanese defenses proved more capable than intelligence estimated, losses could be catastrophic. LeMay spent 3 days analyzing the risks before making his decision. Intelligence indicated that Japan had only 2 night fighter units, which were believed to pose minimal threat. Analysis suggested that poor Japanese fire control tactics meant the additional risk from flying at lower altitude was moderate. The potential rewards finally demonstrating B-29 effectiveness and potentially shortening the war outweighed the dangers. On March 7th, LeMay ordered training missions for selected crews without explaining the actual mission parameters. Pilots practiced low-altitude navigation using radar without being told why. On March 8th, he briefed his wing commanders on the actual plan. The reactions ranged from shock to outright disbelief. Many officers protested that stripping defensive guns and flying at 5,000 feet violated every principle of bomber survival. Some suggested the plan would result in losses exceeding 50%, a rate that would destroy XXI Bomber Command's operational capability in a single night. Others raised moral objections to area attacks designed explicitly to kill civilians, even if those civilians worked in home workshops producing war materials. LeMay listened to the objections, then overrode them. He had no choice. Precision bombing had failed. Conventional attacks were producing negligible results. The invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin in November 1945, would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties if Japanese industrial capacity and civilian morale remained intact. LeMay later stated bluntly, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. It was getting the war over that bothered me." The target selection process revealed the true nature of the mission. When selecting targets for incendiary raids, USAAF planners consulted maps produced by the Office of Strategic Services, which ranked Tokyo's wards by their susceptibility to fire. OSS analysts had considered factors such as average density and structural composition of buildings, and had even utilized risk assessments produced by Japanese insurance companies before the war. They chose the Shitamachi district, a densely populated working-class area near the waterfront, where thousands of small workshops supplied larger factories. The official mission orders stated that the primary purpose was destroying small factories within the target area, but the orders also noted explicitly that civilian casualties were intended as a means of disrupting production at major industrial facilities. There was no pretense of precision. This was area bombing designed to kill enough workers to cripple Japanese industry. LeMay understood the moral weight of what he was ordering. Years later, he would say that if America had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal. But in March 1945, his calculation was grimly practical. Killing 100,000 Japanese civilians in one night might save 500,000 American lives in the invasion. The mathematics of total war permitted no other choice. The B-29 seconds that departed Guam on the evening of March 9th represented the largest concentration of American air power yet assembled for a single mission. The bombers came from three wings, the 73rd, 313th, and 314th Bombardment Wings, each assigned different altitudes within the 5,000 to 7,000 foot band. These altitudes were calculated precisely. Too high for light anti-aircraft guns to reach effectively, too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns to track and fire accurately, and low enough that Japanese optical rangefinders would struggle in darkness. Each aircraft carried approximately 7 tons of incendiary bombs, a mixture of M47 clusters, containing 38 individual bomblets, M69 incendiary clusters that scattered napalm-filled bomblets, and some high-explosive bombs to crater streets and impede firefighting. The total payload for the mission exceeded 1,665 tons of ordnance, nearly all of it designed to create and spread fire rather than destroy structures through blast. The flight to Tokyo took approximately 6 hours. Crews maintained radio silence to avoid alerting Japanese defenses. As they approached the Japanese coast around 11:30 p.m., the lead Pathfinder aircraft flown by experienced crews assigned to mark the target began their bomb runs. Brigadier General Thomas Power, commander of the 314th Bombardment Wing, led the Pathfinders. His orders were to create a visible aiming point for the following bombers. The Pathfinders carried M47 incendiary clusters, mixed with some high-explosive bombs. Their target was the very center of the Shitamachi district, near the intersection where Koto and Chuo wards met along the Sumida River. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, the first Pathfinder aircraft released its bombs over central Tokyo. The incendiaries fell in a precise pattern, creating a flaming X shape visible for miles. Following aircraft simply aimed for this blazing marker, ensuring that subsequent bomb loads reinforced and expanded the initial fires rather than scattering randomly across the city. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Within 15 minutes, hundreds of individual fires had merged into a vast conflagration that created its own weather. Strong natural winds, gusting between 17 and 28 miles per hour, spread the flames rapidly, though the conflagration never quite reached the intensity of a true firestorm. The distinction was academic for people on the ground. The difference between major fire and firestorm mattered little when either meant death. The B-29 crews experienced the attack from a perspective no ground observer could match. They could see the fires from more than 100 miles away, an orange glow on the horizon that grew steadily brighter as they approached. Over the target, the flames illuminated the night sky so completely that crews could read instruments without cockpit lighting. The heat rising from the fires created violent updrafts that tossed 60-ton bombers like toys, making precise navigation difficult and causing some aircraft to gain several thousand feet in seconds. The smell penetrated even at 7,000 feet. Crews not wearing oxygen masks reported a sickening odor they'd never encountered before. Burning wood, burning oil, burning flesh, all mixed into a nauseating stench that permeated the aircraft. Some bombardiers vomited after releasing their loads and seeing the results below. Others refused to look, staring at their instruments and completing their duties mechanically to avoid confronting the horror they were creating. Japanese defenses proved largely ineffective against the low-level night attack. Approximately 27 B-29 seconds were lost during the mission, shot down by anti-aircraft fire, destroyed by fighters, or caught in massive updrafts caused by the fires. The loss rate of roughly 8% was significant but far below the catastrophic casualties some officers had predicted. LeMay's gamble on Japanese defensive inadequacy had proven correct. By dawn on March 10th, approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo had been completely destroyed. More than 100,000 people were estimated dead, and over 1 million were left homeless. The destruction exceeded the combined damage from all previous B-29 raids against Japan. It exceeded the damage from the firebombing of Dresden. It represented the single most destructive conventional air raid in human history. What the statistics couldn't capture was the experience of those on the ground. Tokyo had only 18 concrete air raid shelters, each capable of holding 5,000 people, providing protection for just 90,000 residents out of a population of 4.3 million. By March 1945, the city's buildings were 98% wood and paper construction. When the incendiaries began falling, Tokyo's civilian defense network collapsed almost immediately. Civilians had been organized into more than 140,000 neighborhood firefighting associations with a nominal strength of 2.75 million people, but these were ill-equipped. The basic equipment issued to firefighting associations was incapable of extinguishing fires started by M69 incendiary bombs. Survivors described seeing families running through rivers of fire, holding hands as burning debris blew down streets. One witness recalled seeing a baby on fire on its mother's back, children aflame but still running, desperately seeking escape from the inferno. The Sumida River, which had offered hope of sanctuary, became a mass grave. People threw themselves into the water to escape the flames, but many drowned or died from smoke inhalation. Others, who survived the night in the river, emerged at dawn to find thousands of charred bodies floating in the water. 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto survived with her baby by following her husband's counterintuitive decision to cross the Sumida River away from the crowds. She later recalled, "The B-29 seconds were dropping numerous firebombs and it sounded like a squall. I was astounded to see the intensity of the air raid. I had never seen one before." Her mother, father, and sister perished in the flames. 6-year-old Shizuo Nishio and her mother fled to a school shelter believed to be safe because it was constructed of concrete rather than wood. The shelter became packed beyond capacity. Hours later, approximately 200 people were discovered dead inside, cooked alive in the shelter by the raging fires outside that turned the concrete structure into an oven. The aftermath was equally horrific. Access to basic amenities, gas, electricity, telecommunications, and water was almost entirely non-existent during the first days after the bombing. Finding adequate food proved especially difficult for survivors. Government rations were insufficient to sustain life, and prices on the black market had been substantially inflated. Men, women, and children who'd lost their homes wandered streets carrying whatever belongings they'd managed to salvage, with nowhere to sleep and no resources for rebuilding. The scale of homelessness, 1 million people displaced in a single night, overwhelmed any response capability the city possessed. LeMay received the initial damage assessment reports throughout the morning of March 10th as reconnaissance aircraft photographed the devastation. The photographs showed vast areas of Tokyo reduced to ash and char. Entire neighborhoods had simply ceased to exist. The Sumida River, which had flooded with people seeking escape from the flames, was choked with corpses. Fire breaks and canals that should have stopped the fire's spread had proven useless. The intensity of heat had caused buildings to ignite across these barriers through radiant energy alone. The mission had succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. LeMay immediately ordered planning for follow-up attacks against other Japanese cities. If one night's work could destroy 16 square miles of Tokyo and kill 100,000 people, systematic application of the same tactics could devastate every major urban area in Japan within months. Over the following weeks and months, LeMay's XXI Bomber Command executed exactly that strategy. The B-29 seconds laid waste to other Japanese cities, including Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. On some days, as many as 5 different cities were targeted. During July 1945, more than 150,000 tons of bombs were dropped, resulting in 500,000 dead and 13 million left homeless in more than 20 urban areas. The campaign's effectiveness wasn't measured solely in physical destruction. The psychological impact on Japanese military and civilian leadership proved even more significant. The March 10th raid on Tokyo demonstrated with terrible finality that Japan possessed no effective defense against American air power. If 300 B-29 seconds could burn 16 square miles of the capital in a single night, nothing could prevent them from systematically destroying every city in Japan. This realization spread through Japanese military headquarters in the days following the raid. Officers who'd previously dismissed American bombing as a nuisance began understanding that strategic bombing represented an existential threat. The Americans didn't need to invade Japan, they could simply burn it city by city until surrender became inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Kawabe filed his reconnaissance reports through proper channels, describing the devastation he'd witnessed firsthand. His reports reached senior staff officers who shared them with colleagues over sake in quiet conversations after official meetings ended. The conversations always reached the same conclusion, spoken quietly but with conviction. Japan could not survive this kind of attack repeated against dozens of cities. The mathematical calculation was simple and brutal. Tokyo had approximately 7 million people before the March 10th raid. The attack killed roughly 1.5% of the population in 6 hours. If similar raids hit Tokyo 10 more times, and nothing prevented the Americans from executing exactly that, the city would lose 15% of its population. 20 raids would kill 30%. The actual numbers would likely be worse because people couldn't evacuate fast enough between raids. And Tokyo was just one city. Japan had dozens of urban areas with populations exceeding 100,000. The Americans had hundreds of B-29 seconds and could build more faster than Japan could shoot them down. The logistics favored America overwhelmingly. They could sustain the bombing campaign indefinitely, while Japan's ability to resist diminished with each raid. Senior Japanese officers began having conversations they'd never imagined possible. Men who'd sworn to fight until death began privately discussing whether continued resistance served any purpose beyond increasing casualties. Colonels who'd planned the defense of the home islands began questioning whether defense was possible against an enemy who could incinerate cities from the sky without risking ground troops. These were not defeatists or cowards. These were professional soldiers who'd spent their lives preparing for war, who'd conquered vast territories across Asia, who'd defeated Western powers in dozens of battles. But they were also realists who understood military mathematics. The March 10th raid had changed the calculation irreversibly. Japan could hurt American invasion forces, could inflict terrible casualties, could make conquest expensive. But Japan could not prevent American air power from destroying every city, killing millions of civilians, and rendering the home islands uninhabitable. The conversation that Lieutenant Colonel Kawabe had overheard "We've lost" represented the beginning of a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking. For the first time, senior officers began contemplating surrender not as shameful defeat, but as military necessity. The idea remained unspoken in official meetings and formal reports, but it spread through quiet conversations between trusted colleagues. The irony was profound. Japan had started the Pacific War with a surprise attack designed to cripple American naval power before America could mobilize its vast industrial capacity. Japanese planners had calculated that swift victories would establish a defensive perimeter that America lacked the will to break. The strategy had failed because it underestimated American industrial capability and determination. Now, 4 years later, that industrial capability had produced a bomber that could reach Japan from island bases, carry enough incendiaries to burn entire districts, and return safely despite Japanese defenses. The B-29 represented everything Japanese military planners had feared and tried to prevent American technology and industrial might concentrated into a weapon system that made Japanese defensive preparations irrelevant. LeMay's decision to abandon precision bombing for area incendiary attacks had turned the B-29 from an expensive disappointment into a war-winning weapon. The success vindicated his judgment but came at a terrible price. The strategic bombing campaign directed by LeMay between March and August 1945 may have killed more than 500,000 Japanese civilians and left 5 million homeless. Some 40% of the built-up areas of 66 cities were destroyed. The campaign that began with the Tokyo raid on March 10th would culminate 5 months later with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the psychological break, the moment when Japanese military officers began privately acknowledging that the war was lost, happened that night in March, when 300 B-29 seconds demonstrated that Japan's cities could be destroyed, faster than they could be rebuilt or defended. The officers who witnessed the destruction understood what their political leaders could not yet admit publicly, that continued resistance meant only greater suffering for a population that had already endured beyond reasonable limits. The war would continue for 5 more months, but the certainty of defeat, the knowledge that Japan had truly lost, took hold that night among the professional soldiers whose judgment mattered most. Lieutenant Colonel Kawabe's reconnaissance through burning Tokyo had revealed more than physical destruction. It had revealed the end of Japan's ability to resist effectively. The fires that consumed 16 square miles of the capital also consumed the last realistic hope that Japan could force a negotiated settlement. From March 10th forward, every informed Japanese officer knew the truth, even if they couldn't speak it openly. The war was over. Only the formal surrender remained to be arranged. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.